I strongly believe that our government needs to be run by dedicated public servants. I believe that corrupt, media-obsessed, power-hungry autocrats have no place in our government, whether at the top, at the federal level, or at the city level, or in between. And that's what we have now, and I want to return to open, transparent, collegial government.
I'm Brenda Stratman with Costa Mesa Brief, and we are here today with Sandy Genis, who is running for mayor of Costa Mesa. Welcome.
Welcome.
So let's start. Why are you running for mayor?
I'm running for mayor because I see our city basically at a critical juncture. We have terrible financial problems, and partly due to the coronavirus, but largely due to past bad decisions by the council majority. And we need someone with a level head, with good financial sense, with good common sense. And our city hall has become dysfunctional. The mayor's role is very clearly defined in both our city ordinances and in state law. We're a city manager form of government where the council as a whole decides things, and then the city manager works with staff to implement. So the city manager acts as a funnel, so to speak. That has really broken down due to the actions of some of our electeds right now. And it's important that we have a mayor that appreciates the limits on the power of the mayor under state law to work collaboratively with the rest of the council, as well as to work through the city manager. A mayor is not a mini city manager. A mayor does not order staff around at the line level or even at the department head level. And that has totally broken down. It's led to confusion for staff, and it's led to inefficiencies because people get jerked off of one thing to work on another thing. And it's time we return to the form of government that the people have voted in for our city.
So there's a lot in there we need to break down. So first, let's start with the COVID response. Hasn't that changed a lot of things? We're in the middle of a pandemic. So how has that changed what the mayor has to respond to or what she has to pull the staff off of?
No. The city manager is actually charged with that. As you might have noticed on our agenda, we've had several executive office orders, and those have been affirmed by the council as a whole, but it is not for the city's mayor to determine what staff should be doing at any given time. It's the city council's job with the mayor to determine what the policy will be and set the direction. It is not the city council, any elected official's job to micromanage staff and tell staff, go here, go there, do code enforcement on this one and not on that one. I may get a response from a residence that said, I called code enforcement, I'm not getting any, they're not doing anything, in which case I forward the issue and say, can we do something here? But it's not my job to go and tell the code enforcement officer, go out here, or to tell a police officer, go out there. Unless, of course, I witness a crime or something like that, in which case to go beyond what any citizen might request. It's not the mayor's job, and in fact, that once again creates confusion, especially in a time when you are having extra work. You have the protests, you have the coronavirus, and you have financial pressures, and it's very important that you maintain that structure with the manager and the management team, the police chief, the fire chief, so forth, without any elected sticking their nose in and muddying the waters. And if it is a critical problem that is not being handled by staff, then that's for the whole council to address as a body and look at it in terms of policy and personnel.
So what is your leadership style then?
Collegial, collaborative, and I love working with the city manager to say, what can we do about this? I have some creative ideas. Can we throw it around as a council? We have not had study sessions in months and months, and I'm not talking about since the coronavirus. We've had very, very few study sessions. And that really is an opportunity for the council to, in a more relaxed setting, hash things out, go over the details of a program, as opposed to having something plunked on you at the council meeting. It's not as collaborative a setting, it's more confrontational. I don't see a need for a confrontational approach as we have had for the last couple years. And so I believe in a collegial, collaborative approach. For example, we have 7 members. In some cases, you will have dissenting votes. But there are many times when, say, it might be 4-3 or 5-2, but the people who don't want to go along with the policy say, you know what, I could go for this program if you just change these 2 little things. And they're minor, and they really don't make any difference. Doesn't matter, I have 4 votes, I don't care. And to me, that's really not the best leadership. What you want to do is, if you can get everybody on board and agreeing to a program and happy with a program, just by making a few little tweaks here and there, then you do that, because everybody up there represents somebody. And if you blow those people off, you're blowing off all the thousands of people who voted for them.
So how are you specifically going to bring consensus to the council then?
Well, I would hope that we would have consensus. Number one, I would like to have us do study sessions, go back to the study session approach. Because when there are big issues, it's important to do study sessions. I think with the COVID situation, it's difficult because we're not meeting in person. I hope we can change that soon. We were one of the first councils to not meet in person, and I hope we're not the last to go back to meeting in person, because I think not only does that kind of create a wall between all the different council members, it creates a wall between the council and the public, which is a real problem, I think.
What study sessions are missing?
Well, I understand we're finally going to start some study sessions in September and October. For example, several of us have been talking about short-term rentals. I've brought it up, Alan has brought it up, Andrea's brought it up, that we have an issue. And the problem is it's growing and growing, and then it's going to get to the point where sober living was pretty soon, I think. And so let's look at that. We could have a study session where we throw ideas. We did have one study session regarding our housing issues, and that was, I think, very productive. And you need study sessions on the budget. For example, we just had a proposed project labor agreement, 5-year agreement, where the city would agree that all public, well, not all, pretty much all major public works projects for the next 5 years would be performed only by members of certain unions. And that was plunked on us on a Thursday night, and for a Tuesday council meeting. Very little time to look at it, very little time to think about it. 5-year agreement with no termination clause, unlike just about every other contract that we have. And that's a major commitment, and not one word of discussion in a study session at all. There are a lot of issues. There were minutiae of the contract, but there's also major issues. For example, the termination clause. Are there competing unions that would like to be part of that? What about people who aren't part of a union, who live in Costa Mesa, who would like to work on public works jobs that they're paying taxes to finance? What about volunteers? Fairview Park was included on that list. Does that mean that we would not be able to use volunteer labor for some of our projects in Fairview Park? So there are a lot of questions that really should have been addressed in a study session. At least the concept of this should have been addressed in a study session. And we have major development projects where you throw something with this big a stack of documents at somebody and expect them to address it in one public hearing. Well, that's a joke. You need to sit down, you need to go over things as a group, because sometimes one person says something and it inspires a thought from somebody else, whereas the hearing type of format really does not lend itself to that back and forth discussion, and especially now while we're using Zoom.
During the last election, you ran against Katrina Foley, and she is running for re-election. How do you plan to get more votes this year when before she got almost 60% of the votes?
Well, there are a number of things. Number one, I at one time supported Katrina because I believe she was for transparency, inclusion, sensible development, not runaway development. I thought she was a different person. And now that she's been up there for a couple years, I believe the public has seen, like I saw much sooner, that she really doesn't stand for a lot of the things that she claimed to stand for, which were the very reasons that I had supported her to begin with, and which I would assume would have been the reasons some of the people would have supported her to begin with as well. For example, the Measure R thing. You know, that is the ultimate democracy. It has to do with both sensible growth, and it has to do with including the people. And then we had an effort to change Measure R, or to try to find ways to get projects out exempt from Measure R. To me, that's horrendous. The people voted, they want the right to decide, and they want the right to determine the form of their city in the future. And to me, to disrespect that is horrible.
So a lot of what you're saying, that is things that really do matter, but it's in the background, what the voters don't see or don't realize until it's passed.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the things that the voters are seeing right now that will matter most to them. So let's start with the homeless issue. I went on the city's website, or I think it was the city's website, that lists the homeless count for every year, and it has not changed.
No.
So what can you do differently to address the homeless? Because going back, I think it was to 2014, the numbers have stayed the same on our homeless count.
I know, it's an endless spigot. And it seems like, well, how do we turn it off? We have our shelter now. Now, when we did not have a shelter, we were prevented by law from enforcing our anti-vagrancy rules. Well, now that we are providing shelter for homeless people, then we really do need to step up on our anti-vagrancy because it's not fair to the residents, it's not fair to the businesses. We have social workers. That's a good program, and that has helped a lot. But there are homeless people that we know who just stay on the street. And then we have the sober living situation where people get curbed. And actually that is not happening quite as much, partly because of a change in the insurance structure. So we have fewer sober living homes. And so we have fewer people dumped on the street. We need to make sure we have a bridge for those people who are right now suffering from the effects of job loss from COVID and reduced hours from COVID and that type of situation. And we need to do everything we can to keep those people from basically falling into homeless. But there's a certain amount of chronic homeless that we have to get into shelters, and if they won't get into shelters, then we have to use our enforcement powers to get people to move along. It sounds, you need to have compassion, but you also need to be firm. Even with children, you have to be understanding and compassionate with your children, and you don't come down too hard, but you have to draw a line and let them know that there's a line you do not cross, because things just get worse.
So now let's talk about protesting elected officials' home has in recent weeks become a thing.
Well, I don't think that's a good idea. I haven't, nobody's been outside my house, but I just feel there's a line, and I think it's just a bad idea. I don't think it's fair to families. I don't think it's fair to the other people in the neighborhood. And for all you know, the person that you're protesting might be off in Palm Springs or who knows where. So, and I understand some of these protests are not even from Costa Mesa. I don't know. But protest on a corner, go protest on the main arterials leading into the tract or something. But in front of someone's home, council members are part-timers, and it really is a community service. And to protest in front of someone's home, they have children, they have elderly parents maybe. I don't think that's a good idea at all.
So let's move on to crime. Now, I went on the city's website and got the crime statistics. Unfortunately, for some reason, my computer did not want to pull up anything past 2015. But from 2015 until now, at least, crime has been in a steady decline in our city. What has the city done right for that, and what can the city do differently if you were mayor?
Well, one of the things that affects crime is demographics, of course. A lot of the crime waves tend to be regional or even national. It depends on, for example, when the boomers were all like 20-year-olds, oh my gosh, crime was horrible. There is an uptick in complaints on petty crimes. People aren't being, gunned down in the streets. I hope. I would say knock on wood, there's nothing to knock on. But there's a lot of mail theft, package theft, shoplifting, and part of that is the state now defines anything from $900. Of course, that was from 2015 as well. Anything under $950 is petty theft, so it's not really considered a major crime. So part of it has to do with crime reporting, but also it's sometimes people don't even call anymore. This is the really unfortunate thing. If you look at Nextdoor or you look at Facebook, there are people who have something, they show this on their Ring doorbell, they show the video, watch out for this guy. Well, did you call it in? Well, there's no point, which is really, really sad. There's a lot of the small, annoying, irritating crimes that don't go into the major statistics. And another concern of mine is, now that we're in lockdown, how much domestic abuse is occurring, both to women and to children, that nobody knows now. The children aren't in school, the wives aren't going to their jobs. What is happening in these homes? And are people calling it in? Are people calling in about disturbances next door? That's another problem we've had about slow response on neighborhood disturbances. Now, our numbers went up in terms of police officers. In about 2012, we were down to just a little over 100 officers. Then when you take out people who are injured and so forth, at one point we had only 90 boots on the street, which was really bad for a city this size. We now we're budgeted for 136 sworn officers. During the budget talks, we're at about 128, but then people retire, but we bring in new people, so we're a little under 130. But then once again, you have people who are injured, on disability and so forth, and we really do need to get our numbers back up to the 136 that's budgeted, and then possibly even more. Because part of the problem is when you're understaffed, you're running from call to call to call to call, you don't have time for the community policing where you build the relationships in the neighborhood, where people feel free to talk to their officer for their area. They feel that the police officers are their friends, and that's especially important in this climate now where there's a growing distrust of the police in some sectors. And that's really unfortunate, because the police really are there to protect and serve. And I'd say the vast, vast, vast majority of our police officers still believe they're there to protect and serve.
I would like to acknowledge that the Costa Mesa Police Department has pretty much stayed out of controversies like that. We haven't had any videos of our police being unfair to people.
But we're getting body cams.
Oh, good.
We are, and that's something I'm excited about. We are improving our communication system. That's another issue. We were so far down on dispatch. And then in past years, I don't know if you guys have heard me rant about generators. We need the generators, we need the generators. Well, last year, somebody hit a power box and we lost the power to the emergency operations center. And we were running dispatch off of cell phones. And then it was being routed over to Newport and then routed back, and they were trying to figure out, like, was there a huge disaster or something? No, we just had a power failure, which is also embarrassing. But it reduced efficiency too when you're trying to use outmoded equipment. And so we're getting more current equipment, current dispatch equipment, and we have changed our structure for our dispatchers, so at the salaries and personnel type stuff. So we are hoping we can rebuild there, because that's a huge issue, because you could have people ready to go, but if you don't have people processing the calls and getting them through to the people who are ready to go, that creates a huge backlog.
Would you have done anything different in the response to the pandemic?
I would have not closed the parks. I believe I would. The state had a mask order. I still encourage use of masks, and I think as long as we take the approach that we're taking now, where we tell people to wear masks and then we remind them, but we're not going to go hit them upside the head with 2x4 if they don't. And then as far as businesses, we could have jumped on things a little earlier maybe to provide some flexibility, because I had even forwarded some articles from because we had this committee that got formed. And the thing is, because it's an ad hoc committee, it's not subject to the Brown Act, which then meant, because it was ad hoc, if any other council members even wanted to attend, we were told that that would cause it to be a Brown Act committee, which I was fine with, let the public come. But it was basically a closed door committee. Our list said, well, I would like to sit in and just watch. No, you can't. I said, I'd like to sit in. So the public, not only does the public not get to see what happens with that committee, but other council members. But I did forward a few things, like articles on what was being done in places in Europe, because they got hit before we did, and so they were in recovery afterwards. And we're doing some of them now, but it took a little while.
One other thing is the city's reserves.
Yes.
So where does it sit at right now?
Well, right now we're going to be a little below where we were last year, but we're shaky. And our budget, we really did some cutting, but it's still sort of optimistic. For example, in past years, we had $1 million for contingencies. And some people said, oh, that's just mad money. No, it wasn't. Contingency went a long way, for example, towards paying attorneys for the sober living lawsuits. Contingencies went for paying for certain things related to homelessness. And so, but we still went into reserves. And people would say, well, we wouldn't have gone into reserves except for the sober living lawsuit. We wouldn't have gone into reserves except for the homelessness issue. But that's why you have a contingency fund. This year, our contingency fund is only $125,000, which means that when we get the homelessness issue, we get the sober living issue, or whatever, the COVID-19, although that's a large part of that is supposed to come back to us from the state, but I'm not holding my breath on a lot of that. That you have to have a little bit of a cushion. Right now, we're looking at probably, even for our ongoing sober living expenses, sober living litigation expenses, we will probably be going into reserves further for that. And the problem was we didn't build them up. Our reserves hit a low of about 45 million at the end of, or 43 million, at the end of the last recession. Then they gradually went up till 2016. And they were about 55, 60 million. And now they're gradually going down again. And they've been going down since 2016. So this is not as a result of the COVID-19. As a matter of fact, last year's budget projected that in 3 years, even with fairly optimistic, no big crises or anything, optimistic projections, we would be out of reserves.
So what was the reserves used for?
Well, the reserves are basically for situations like this. Like, say, where you have, like the last recession, they used 30 million in reserves, but they started out at 75 million, so they were pretty well fixed. You use your reserves, for example, you can draw on it on a short term, like now we do have the COVID-19 situation, but we don't know how long it's going to last. That's, once again, is there going to be another surge? Are they going to shut down businesses again? How should we plan? So you fall back on that, but you have to build them up in the interim. You don't just say, okay, 20 years ago, people saved a bunch of money and then we just use it up and use it up and use it up and never put any back.
But what was it used on? Once it was built up, what did we use it on that drained it?
Well, they used it for day-to-day expenses during the recession from 2009 to 2011, and part of that was a reluctance to cut expenses. There were some expenses that were cut, but they didn't start cutting the way they should have. And then there are things, for example, we used part of our reserves when we were buying the homeless shelter or paying for the homeless shelter issues. We used part of our reserves to pay for litigation relating to sober living. And then it's just at the end of the year, it's not like you say, okay, I wrote a check out of the reserves. It's that the checks keep coming out of the general fund. And then at the end of the year, it's sort of like, you have a checking account. You keep writing it, and writing it, and writing it. And then you go, oops, we used it all up. And then there are things you need to have it, for example, natural disaster. I would class this as a natural disaster. But the fact is, we were in a world of hurt before the coronavirus hit. We were already scrambling last year. At the end of last year's budget, best economic times in decades. And we had to forego part of our budget for several months while we figured out how we were going to pay for some really necessary equipment and so forth for our police department, for public safety. We couldn't even balance our budget last year without really scrambling. And that was in really good economic times because we always not always, but for the last several years have just spent whatever came in and really not taking much thought for the next day. And now
what is it being spent on?
It's just little stuff. I mean, some of it's not like we say, okay, here is the reserve account. We have a general fund account from which we take money. And we take money, it goes for salaries. Say we had more overtime than we would have expected. We had more of this than we would have expected. At the end of the year, when we balance our checkbook, we find out there's less in it than we thought we had or that we planned on having. So it went from everything, from a big thing like paying for, like we as a group decided to take some money to pay for the homeless shelter, to things like at the end of the year, like for example, $50,000 for a fireworks show. Now, it wasn't said that that was taken from reserves, but it came out of the general fund. And then when we didn't have general fund money for other things that were really, really necessary, then those things had to come out of reserves. So it becomes a situation where, like say if you budgeted and you had X amount for medical expenses, X amount for a vacation, and X amount for food and rent. Well, you get really sick. Your medical expenses go up. And instead of saying, okay, we had X amount for a vacation, let's take that money to pay for our medical expenses. No, you just go into debt for your medical expenses and then still take the vacation. And that's sort of what Costa Mesa has been doing.
And one last question before we wrap up. Why should the voters of Costa Mesa vote for you?
Because it's a time when we need common sense, we need financial sense, and we need someone who basically cares about the city of Costa Mesa. I'm planning on growing old here, assuming it doesn't go down the tubes. And that's it. I want this city to be a place where families continue to come, where people age in place, where we have a good quality of life for our residents, a good business climate for our businesses. And we don't just respond to the fad of the moment, and especially on the financial issues. We have good finance staff, but if the council will not adopt the policies and the spending priorities that we need to, then we're going to be in a world of hurt. And you saw the potholes and you see just things being a little raggedy around the edges. It'll get a whole lot worse if we don't get our financial house in order.